My name is George Galloway, presenter of كلمة on Almayadeen television. Mind you, I don't mince my words. I speak كلمة and my audience does too. كلمة free word, free for me, free for you. Catch it. Nice to meet you, brother. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Almayadeen television. Coming to you from London, but discussing the United States of America. It's not very controversial to say that the United States is a divided country, more divided than united. And on a knife edge, almost all of their politics breaks more or less 50-50 between the two behemoth political parties. Their last president had his home raided by the FBI and may yet face criminal charges. The supporters of Donald Trump contain some of the most militant people in America. And if Trump were to be arrested, indicted, somehow put out of the 2024 presidential election, the balloon might go up. There are almost 400 million guns in the United States of America and only 331 million people. And many of those guns are automatic weapons, and most of them are in the hands of militant white people, most of whom support Donald Trump. You see where I'm going here. The political division in the United States could well erupt into violence, maybe even, in the worst case, a new civil war. The US is divided across many axes, of course, not just white and black and Hispanic, but rich and poor, north and south, east and west, and most of the political power lives on the East Coast and the West Coast. As a man who's now been sacked from Twitter, about whom you'll learn much more later when my legal case against them finally reaches the courts, said, we fly over the parts of the United States that vote for Donald Trump for a good reason. This kind of patrician, Ivy League snobbery is one of the many dividing lines in American society. But it's divided on gender, it's divided on abortion as an issue, and it's divided, of course, politically. The working people don't really have a party in the United States. Both the Democrats and the Republicans are as close as you can get to two cheeks of the same backside. None of them, neither of them, does anything for the mass of the working people, white and black, in the United States of America. But that's not how they see it. So they support these two partisan political parties as if their lives depended on it, as if the quality of their lives depended on it. And America has done well, of course, over the last couple of centuries, since they massacred the indigenous inhabitants, since they brought millions of black Africans in change as slaves. They have built a very successful country, and it has, until now, managed to contain the divisions that are within it. But on January 6th of 2022, we saw perhaps a small cloud, certainly by comparison with civil disturbances in Europe. It may have been a small cloud, but it could have been a harbinger of great storms to come. So we are asking the question on كلمة this episode, will the divisions in the United States turn violent? I'm joined, as always, by a distinguished panel of experts, two of them former parliamentary colleagues of mine from both sides of the House, and one young man who wasn't born when we left Parliament. I suspect that that is the case. But first up, out of respect and admiration and love, is Ken Livingstone, the first and finest Mayor of London, twice elected as London's Mayor. Will the United States turn ugly?
I think it is, because inequality is getting worse. There must be so much anger amongst people there. Ordinary working class and middle class families, every year their real income going down and the prospects for their kids getting worse. And yet it still remains fabulously wealthy for that very small, rich elite. But I think also what's going to divide America is that within a few years the economy will be overtaken by China. And they've dominated, I mean, as you just said, over a century, they've been the dominant power in the world. That's about to end. And I think that will lead to a lot more division, perhaps a lot more violence.
Could it conceivably turn into civil insurrection, civil war?
I think it is, because you mentioned the amazing gun powers.
400 million.
Yeah, unbelievable. But then on an average year, 46,000 Americans are killed by guns. 46,000. That's devastating. And thank God we don't have that here, or you and I might be dead by now.
Jacques Arnold, former Conservative Member of Parliament, former colleague of mine. It's not just that it's 46,000 deaths a year by gunfire in the US, it's that many of them are children in schools. Many of them are shoppers in malls. Many of them are dancers in nightclubs, revelers, party goers. There's already a level of incipient violence in the US. The country was built on massive violence, the violence of slavery, the violence of the slaying of the indigenous people and the stealing of their land. How confident are you that the US can continue to sail on regardless?
I think it will continue to sail on for the very simple reason that the United States is a leading, vibrant democracy. Having said that, their selection of presidential candidates in recent years have been absolutely woeful, and they've suffered the consequences accordingly. But it's certainly a vibrant democracy, as we saw in this recent half-term elections. The most significant outturn of that was the fact that Trump-endorsed candidates pretty well uniformly did badly. And I think that's highly significant, because I think the American people may well have seen through Trump and all his works and want to move on, which will be a particular advantage to the Republicans. And actually, one of the most significant results in particular was that in Miami, in Florida, where very strong, what I would call conservative kind of views, struck a very strong chord, not only with the elderly retired population, but interestingly with the Hispanics. Because a lot of the Hispanics that came to the United States came because they wanted to make their fortune and wanted to make a good life for their families. And of course, as we all know, perhaps you gentlemen don't, the best way of going about that is through free enterprise and indeed capitalism.
Well, Mohid, Rehman, Malik, you are an American expert, international relations expert, a US projects graduate at the Phelan US Centre, and previously at our own London School of Economics. We won't blame you for deserting England for the United States. I'm sure it's professionally a good move. But you know closely the stresses and strains in American society. Can they be contained?
Well, yeah, it's a hard one to say. I actually want to go back to something earlier that you said, Mr. Galloway, in terms of the history of the United States and just how wrought it has been with violence. We need to put this particular moment within this larger context. In the 1960s, political tensions were also incredibly high. with the civil rights movement. Actually, it's interesting because Martin Luther King, he wrote in the 1960s saying that constructive nonviolent, emphasis on nonviolent political tension is a good thing. And, you know, political tension, it speaks to an issue, right? And I think sometimes, particularly with the mainstream media, we sometimes get caught up in only wanting to discuss the existence of political tension and not the political and social malaise that have contributed to it, right? Because it's highlighting something as to, you know, why are people going out on the streets? Why do people feel like the election was stolen from them? Irrespective of the truth or false, which of course is important, the fact that these sentiments exist and are so widespread is telling, and it's reflective of democracy in many ways failing in the United States. But in terms of whether or not it can be contained, you know, a lot of political commentators call this a cold civil war. I don't know if, you know, this cold civil war will ever become hot. Hopefully not. I'm unsure of whether there'll ever be a, you know, large-scale violence, particularly because it's hard to see, you know, where would the country really even divide? Because Democrats and Republicans, as much as they don't see eye to eye, they live together. You know, in a lot of these counties and a lot of these precincts, they're not, you know, it's not neatly divided per se. So it's hard, you know, Pennsylvania is a state that can go can go Republican or Democrat. I mean, where would that go in a future, you know, divided United States? So I think because of certain structural reasons, perhaps violence will not break out, but I don't think that that's a good condition to just have exist if you're not able
Well,
to.
I was surprised that my colleague Jacques prayed in aid of America's future, its democracy. A democracy that elects Joe Biden, who, not to put too fine a point on it, is not the sharpest tool in the box any longer.
Precisely my
And
point.
previously, Donald Trump, who, notwithstanding his own conservative views, Jacques scorns, doesn't sound or look like too healthy a democracy. And when a significant portion, well over half, of the voters of defeated candidates believe that they were cheated in the election, and there is some evidence that in some places they were, democracy, it seems to me, is about the last thing you could pray in aid of America's security going forward.
Sure. Yeah, and I think this speaks to the wider problem of this two-party political system and the fact that Americans at this point are now their identity is almost wholly based on their partisanship. It doesn't matter whether you're a union worker, whether you are a teacher, whether, you know, what your profession is, even in some cases what your race is. You know, a lot of these other forms of one's identity and the attributes that make us who we are has become irrelevant. And what matters is whether you have a D or an R next to your name. And this this dichotomy is deeply troubling. And it allows for this type of resentment to fester because you have a very clear target.
Not least because both the D and the R seem to stand for exactly the same things. Let's go across to New York City and talk to the journalist and political analyst Caleb Maupin. Caleb, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
The DHS, Department of Homeland Security, has recently said that political tension in the United States is taking the country by storm. How likely is it that that tension could lead to political violence?
I think the situation is quite serious because there are big divisions within the U.S. political landscape, and our leaders are doing very little to bring the country together. People have questions about election results. There are big differences culturally when it comes to issues related to school children and what they should be taught and what types of things are appropriate and what are not. There's also a pretty clear understanding on a big chunk of the population that they are not interested in maintaining a global financial system. They're more concerned with making sure that there's jobs and healthcare and education here at home. And it seems like the population is very much being whipsawed. They're very much trying to play certain demographics against other demographics so that the Wall Street monopolists can stay at the top.
We've seen recently the act of violence, though it's shrouded in a lot of mystery and might not be exactly as it appeared at the time. the attack on Paul Pelosi by someone who was in his house, he being, of course, the husband of the then Speaker of the House of Representatives. People say that it's disinformation that is creating the atmosphere in which political acts of violence, if that was one of those, are taking place. What do you think of that?
No, I would argue that it's not disinformation that's causing the rise of unrest in the country. It's true information. It's true information about the opioid epidemic that is claiming so many working class lives across the country. It's true information about the inflation that is squeezing working families when they go to fill up their gas tank or they go to the grocery store to buy food. It's true information about our crumbling infrastructure, the fact that the roads are falling apart, the fact that the bridges and highways and power facilities are falling to pieces. It's true information about the demoralization facing the next generation and our very high suicide rate. It's not disinformation that's causing this. It is the truth about the collapse of the United States from within and the decay of the lives of working people. People are upset, they are angry, and our leaders are failing to provide any real solutions.
Do you think this political violence is coming from and might come from one side or the other, or both sides?
Well, on the one hand, there is talk of extremism and talk of violence and such from our elected leaders. But there's also been an attempt to normalize violence on the part of our political establishment. When Will Smith struck the comedian at the Oscars, that was kind of hailed as, oh, he was sticking up for his woman, or he was sticking up for his wife. This was seen as somehow being heroic. Furthermore, the unrest that has swept the country, the protests and the chaos in the streets that preceded the election in which Donald Trump was defeated by Joe Biden, that was glorified by the media. And at the same time that they are promoting political violence and they seem to celebrate horrendous acts like the brutal murder of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. We saw Hillary Clinton, how she cheered for it. She said, we came, we saw, he died, and she giggled about it. At the same time, they cheer for violence all around the world, and they cheer for some political violence here at home. They're also concerned about this rising level of violence against elected officials. There's the continued hearings about January 6th. So there's a large amount of hypocrisy. They like some violence, and they dislike other violence.
Again, the DHS report indicates that a vast number of Americans think that the government, the state, has overreached itself, and the state's credibility amongst the public is much less than it was according to every poll that is taken. And now we're in a pre-election period. We're always in a pre-election period in the United States. In the run-up to the next elections, are you expecting an increase in political violence, maybe even against individual politicians, government officials, law enforcement, and the rest?
I think there will be an increase in tension, largely due to the fact that the Biden administration is not doing anything to bridge the gap. Instead, they are weaponizing the Department of Justice. They are targeting anti-abortion activists. They are targeting people who want peace with Russia. They are using their power as the executive branch to go after people on the other side of the political spectrum. And Tulsi Gabbard and others have called them out for this, that there's increasingly an effort on the part of the Biden camp not to try and bridge the political gap, but rather to intensify things, to intensify the rhetoric against Russia, to continue to demonize people of the political right wing. Before the midterm elections happened, Joe Biden accused a big chunk of the country, who are Republicans and conservatives, accused them of being fascists. And gave this speech before a bunch of American flags. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party has turned on the railroad workers. The railroad workers, were approaching a strike, and the Democratic Party, that claims to be pro-labor, outlawed the strike of the railroad workers and now has proceeded to start demonizing the railroad workers and their unions. And so we see an increased effort to push people into situations where they feel they don't have expression within regular political discourse and through regular political means. People are questioning election results. People are being censored on social media. Their ability to debate and their ability to express themselves at the polls is something that people feel is being taken away. And when people aren't able to vote their conscience and express themselves at the ballot box, when people aren't able to express themselves on social media and are being silenced, often they will turn to other methods. I certainly don't condone that. I favor political discourse continuing in a free and open way. I favor, peaceful methods of change, people voting and participating. But when such means are cut off, people will become desperate. And if you look at the economic conditions of the country, they are becoming more desperate. It's leading many Americans to feel that they don't have the options they would normally have in a healthy society.
Ken Livingstone, these, we used to call them hot button issues. We now call them, I think, culture war issues. They're tossed into the political fray as a diversion, aren't they? Issues of the trans controversies, the LGBTQIA plus, I think it has now reached in the alphabet soup, abortion. All of these are thrown in to keep people's minds off the meat and veg of politics. No?
Yeah, and of course the interesting thing, I was born at the end of the war. I grew up in a Britain where if you were a gay man, you were sent to prison. Abortion was illegal. And then that Labour government in the 60s did transform our way of life. But I think things are getting worse now, not just in America, but here as well. I think there's a much more of a move to real right-wing, hard-line right-wing politics. And I'm not seeing a real alternative coming from the left of politics that we used to have, 30, 40 years ago. And therefore, I'm more pessimistic about our future now than I've ever been in my life. Every day, I worry what it's going to be like for my kids in 20 years. Governments all around the world are failing.
Jacques, these culture war issues are the real dividing line, aren't they, in America? It's not about the level, gargantuan, eye-watering level of defense spending. It's not about the inflation. It's not about the economy. It's about where you stand on the rainbow, isn't it?
Well, I think one of the rather unfortunate imports from America we've had over recent years has all been what, in some ways, I would call an irrelevance and a claptrap. Our serious problems, of course, are with the economy, and Vladimir Putin's ridiculous expedition into Ukraine hasn't helped matters because of the economic distortions he's brought about, not only in fuel but in grain, causing starvation in Africa. These are the issues for discourse. And what worries me slightly as a former parliamentarian is the trivia with which so many politicians nowadays immerse themselves, whereas the key issues need tackling. And sadly, it has taken economic disruption on this scale, and with it inflation, to force politicians to get back to discussing issues which are of most relevance and vital importance to the families and for the voters of this country.
Well, of course, the political system in the United States is headed by Joe Biden, and I'm not sure how able he is nowadays to get to grips with the big political divide, and how credible the political class is in keeping the lid on what we might say is a simmering, if not smouldering, level of violence in the country. If there becomes a fusion between the incipient violence in America and the political differences in America, well, that'll be a big bonfire. I'll be right back. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalimahora with me, George Galloway, on Almayadeen Television, coming to you from London, but talking about the United States of America, a very violent country with a very large number of guns in the hands of hundreds of millions of people. In fact, 1.3 guns for every person in the country. And of course that includes the children, many of whom will later be slaughtered in their classrooms, in the shopping malls with their mothers, or when they're teenagers dancing in clubs. The violence on which the United States was built, more than 100 million indigenous Americans died after the landing of the white settler populations from, of course, Spain first and then Britain, but also France, 100 million people. And then, of course, came the slaves, the violence of slavery. So violence is absolutely no stranger to America. In a way, it's amazing that we're even questioning whether the country will lapse into large-scale political violence, as indeed it was built on such a basis. But let's hear from an English academic, Professor Alec Charles, writer and thinker and retired University of Winchester professor. Professor Alec, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, George. It's great to be here.
Professor, it's clear that political tension in the United States is high, ineluctably leading to political violence or not. What's your opinion on that?
There are extreme elements in the United States, as there are in many countries in the world. We've just seen, of course, in Germany, extreme elements apparently planning to attempt some kind of violent insurrection against a democratically elected parliament. We've seen that in the United States under Donald Trump, of course. Donald Trump's attempt to stir up armed insurrection against the democratic processes of the country. I think what's interesting at the moment, though, of course, is that Donald Trump's fortunes have plummeted very, very badly. Donald Trump has lost a great deal of his credibility. We saw, of course, in the midterm elections that those candidates supported by Donald Trump tended to do very badly, even against a perceived weak Democrat administration in the United States. We've also, of course, seen recently that Donald Trump's corporate fortunes have not been doing too well in the courts. And we've seen the Trump Corporation being found guilty in a New York court for certain tax irregularities. And therefore, Donald Trump is not to be written off. We've written him off before and he's come back. But Donald Trump's support, his popular support, seems to be much, much less than it was in the last days of his presidency and in the early days of the Biden presidency. This is quite extraordinary because the Biden presidency has hardly been meteoric in its successes, and yet Biden has not messed up in the way that Trump said that he was going to mess up, and Trump appears to be just continuing to mess up worse and worse.
Is it just political division that could push towards widespread violence in the United States, or are there other factors like the economy, for example, like race and other things?
The worry, though, is in the United States, as the United States is currently teetering on the brink of economic recession. It's not hit recession yet, but it looks like it may go towards recession. The worry is that the Trump supportists that are still there are no longer the mainstream Trump supportists. They're the supporters, they're the real extreme Trumpite supporters. And that could cause concern. We may well see a situation, again, similar to what happened in the Capitol during the senatorial meeting to endorse President Biden's winning of the election. We may well see scenes similar to what we've seen in Germany recently, but we must recall that these are not popular uprisings. These are extremist attempts at insurrection. These are minority forces. They are, however, violent forces, they're radicalized, they're terrorists in the true sense of the term, that this is real domestic terrorism. And there is danger in that. There's real danger in that. There's danger of violence against individuals. I don't think there is any danger of the overthrow of American democracy any more than German democracy was in danger, in any real danger. But the lives of individual politicians, of individual law enforcement people are, I think, very possibly at significant risk.
You highlighted the violence of Trump supporters, perhaps with reference to January 6th and the so-called insurrection there, though it's worth remembering only 2 people died and both of them were killed by law enforcement. But the violence can come from the other side too, can't it? Not just individual acts against right-wing politicians, but also the mass violence that broke out after the murder of George Floyd by a Minnesota police officer.
The threat of terrorist violence, domestic terrorist violence, comes from both the left and right in politics. But what we've seen in recent years in Europe, Britain, and the United States is that there is a particular danger from the extreme right. The worry in the United States is, of course, that Donald Trump courts the support of those extreme right-wingers. Indeed, he seems to apologize for their acts. He seems to defend their acts. And so, although I don't believe that there will be a successful armed insurrection in the United States, there may still be significant violence against American politicians, against American law enforcement officials, and against American people, and possibly particularly people of color.
Well, the Department of Homeland Security gave a very serious warning of the risk of political violence in the run-up to the next presidential election. Do you think they've got that right?
There may be violence before the next American election, but perhaps there's more likely to be violence in its immediate wake. After all, last time we saw supporters of Donald Trump who were unhappy with the results, and it was at that point that they turned to violence. There may well be violence or threats of violence during the Republican primaries. There's a real danger of intimidation of moderate, reasonable Republican candidates, and I think that moderate, reasonable Republicans will already be worried about this. Donald Trump could always stand up and say to his more extreme supporters to stop this, but he hasn't done that in the past, and I don't think he'll do it now. I think it's a great shame. I don't think that American democracy is at risk any more than German democracy was at risk from a group of crazy right-wing extremists. But individual lives are at risk. The lives of politicians, the lives of law enforcement professionals, and indeed the lives of ordinary people, and perhaps in the United States, particularly people of color. And that's a real serious concern.
Mohid, most people watching this in the Middle East will not recognize the January 6th, 2022 events as violence. Only 2 people were killed. Both of them were killed by law enforcement, not by these violent extremists, terrorists, as the professor was calling them. Nonetheless, as you yourself said, in the 1960s, there was significant history-changing acts of terrorist violence against the president of the country, against his brother, who was about to become almost certainly the president, against black leaders, Dr. King, Malcolm X, and so many others. They seem to have, after the 60s, dropped the tactic of individual assassinations. The professor seems to be suggesting that that might be an era about to return. What do you think?
Well, one of the issues if you look at whether it's the Global Terrorism Database, whether it's from the Center of Strategic and International Studies, one of the issues that they have identified is in the United States of America right now, most acts of political violence are coming from lone actors. They don't belong to an organized political groups. I do think, though, that it's important to identify who are the perpetrators of the acts of violence. It's all well and good to say that it does come from both sides, and of course, there is the rhetoric on both sides can often be quite deplorable, but as every major database has shown, most of the violence does come from the right wing. And if we're
What about the whole Black Lives Matter phenomenon?
Sure.
Of cities burning? They weren't coming from the right wing.
And I take that point. Personally, this is almost going to become a philosophical conversation, but I don't know if I can classify what the Black Lives Matter movement, the acts of violence that accompanied them in June of 2020 after the death of George Floyd. I don't know if I can group that in the same category as what we saw in January 6th, because one is an act of frustration with a system that has a complete disregard for Black Americans in terms of their handling with the law enforcement, and the other is a feeling amongst people, amongst particularly white Americans, conservatives, who feel that their country is being taken away from them by these liberal elitists. To the extent that that is true or not, in terms of from an economic point of view, that's another conversation. But I think, in my mind, it is very clear that the strong acts of violence are coming from way more from one side than another.
Jacques Arnold, that's an interesting dichotomy, notwithstanding your new liberalism, which surprises me every time I reacquaint with you. Do you accept that the violence of the summer of 2020, the Black Lives Matter, widespread destruction and attacks, ironically, on law enforcement, calls to defund the police? Mohid thinks, philosophically, that's a different kind of violence and one which is more understandable than the actually very little violence on January the 6th.
I think any form of violence in politics is a retrograde step, quite obviously so. But I think when you actually look at America, the phrase, let's move on, you and I have heard that in Parliament many a time. That usually means politicians made an absolute foul mess, so let's step over it and press on to the sunny uplands. But there's no doubt in my mind that the United States is firmly subject now to that phrase, because quite frankly, what are we going to get next time? Trump and all his extreme rhetoric versus Biden out of his geriatric home, perhaps? A total farce. It's time that American politics moved on. And I think that the halftime elections recently, when we saw what happened in Florida and DeSantis, is a fairly good example that there will be a competition on the Republican side. I think the Democrats must sit down and say, look, it's not time for geriatrics, it's time to move on and select a new generation of politicians. So at least the last two American presidential elections, what an awful choice to make between what was offered. Surely these 2 years must be for the two major American parties to produce candidates who are worthy of the office of the President of the United States so that the people of that country can have a choice.
Well, why don't they, Ken Livingstone? How come the most successful country in the history of the world produces presidential candidates that most people in the world wouldn't trust with the keys to the car, never mind the keys to the nuclear weapons?
I think a big part of the problem is Biden is 80 years old, and I don't really think you can be on top of a job with so much pressure every day, so many decisions you have to make at that age. And I want to see a new generation of American politicians coming up, more optimistic about the future and having real ideas about how we tackle climate change and all these other things. I mean, Biden is like something from the distant past, and that's been a big mistake. He's not as bad as Trump, of course, but, literally.
I think he's much worse than Trump, but that's another program.
No, we disagree on that.
Much worse. Mohid, of course, the cry for new blood, for a new generation, the torch passing and all of that, this is normal. But it isn't likely, is it? Notwithstanding my colleagues' best wishes, Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee next time, as the professor said. Mustn't write him off. We've written him off before. I can assure you, as someone who studies Republican politics very closely, Trump will be the nominee, maybe with DeSantis as his running mate. But if Trump is the nominee, are the Democrats really going to put up Joe Biden, aged by then 82, for another term?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm honestly not sure. I don't know, though, who they would put up other than him.
Kamala Harris is even less popular than Joe Biden.
That's exactly it. You know, she doesn't, at least Joe Biden, you know, he is somewhat likable, right? There's something about his personality, you know, his background. He's not seen in the same way that Kamala Harris, certainly the way that Hillary Clinton was seen. And I do concur. I do think that Donald Trump will probably get the nomination. And actually what he's doing this time around is quite smart. It is true that all the people, by and large, that he supported in the midterms didn't perform that well, but he understands the system now. He is going to be much more ready. He definitely feels like the election was, you know, to some extent taken from him. And in terms of who the Democrats can run, I honestly have no idea. There's not one person. They're not going to run somebody who's very young and inexperienced, like an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or people of, you know, they call the squad, Jamal Bowman, for example, the more progressive candidates. The Democratic Party isn't really about the progressive candidates. But I don't know who in the establishment they could run.
They could run an even older fellow, Bernie Sanders.
I mean,
if they'd allowed him to win in the first place, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Yeah. Or Boris Johnson, who's an American-born.
Boris Johnson, there's an idea. Give him a
worst Prime Minister of my lifetime.
Give that man a green card. You obviously missed Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak.
Yeah.
Mohid, staying with you. Yep. If Trump, it's a big if, if Trump wins the presidential election, the tables will merely turn, won't they? Because there will be tens of millions of Americans that won't accept that result. Yeah. The pussy hats will be back on the street demonstrating. Every foolish statement that Trump makes will be turned into a potential cause of insurrection. What I'm trying to say is, whichever way US politics goes, these extant divisions will continue to burn.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I don't know, to be honest, what the solution to that is. Donald Trump is, you know, he is obviously the symptom of a much larger problem within American politics that we've just, you know, alluded to earlier in terms of these deep structural issues that do exist.
Well, their inequality is so much worse than ours. And that's the problem.
Yeah, but the poor white workers support Donald Trump, not Joe Biden.
I know they're mad.
Well, many of the people who also supported Donald Trump actually voted for Barack Obama too, particularly in the states like Ohio and Pennsylvania, which were so crucial for Trump to win in 2016, right? So it's hard to make this division of people just vote for Donald Trump because of just specific identity points. A lot of it does come down to economics.
Well, yeah, I mean, it suits liberals to believe it, but it isn't true. The majority of black women, for example, voted for Donald Trump both times. More than 50% of black women voted for Donald Trump on both occasions.
That's amazing.
And will do so again. His support amongst Hispanics grew very significantly, and as Jacques said, Hispanics in the state of Florida have gone very, very heavily towards the Republican Party. So easy tropes about white reactionaries and people of color being with the Democrats are no longer valid, I think. Just time for one last round.
Party here.
Jacques, the fear of widespread violence in the United States, I mean political violence. There's already widespread violence on a daily basis, as Ken said earlier in the show. But the fear of widespread political violence, you think, is being overstated?
I think it's way overstated. I think if it came to it, that the forces of law and order would be exerted, something no political leaders would like to see, but if necessary, you saw what the Germans did about this particular set of nutcases recently. I think any elected government has to take the necessary steps for civil order. I very much hope it doesn't come to that. Personally, I think it's unlikely, but there we are.
The law and order forces are pretty unpopular in the United States amongst very large sections of the population.
Nevertheless, needs must, should that situation arise. I rather suspect and hope that it won't arise.
Ken Livingstone, are we being pessimistic in projecting onto the potential situation in the US real serious trouble?
Well, it is pessimistic, but I think it's also realistic. I mean, in all my life, I've never been so worried about the future that's emerging here. And I think you could get, much more violence coming into American politics. People are getting angrier and angrier. They feel left out. And, it's not just happening in America. I say in many countries around the world, it's getting worse.
Mohid, last word to you. The torch is passing to a new generation. We don't get it in America. The economic facts in America are, as Ken Livingstone and Caleb Maupin highlighted, getting worse instead of better. The middle class is, of course, Americans call working class people middle class, but the middle class, that is to say what we call the professional classes, and the blue-collar working class are being squeezed down into one. The billionaires, some cases trillionaires, are becoming fantastically more wealthy. Far more money in America is spent on weapons of war than on bridges and highways and public schools and the rest. If I were a visitor from Mars, I wouldn't think that political violence in the United States was a far-fetched or exaggerated idea at all in the face of all these incontestable facts that I have just adumbrated.
Yeah, and I think what's happened is the general public in the United States has been given the wrong enemy to focus on. And unfortunately, we now have a situation where around 40% of both Democrats and Republicans view the other side as being evil. And when you view someone as being evil, philosophically, morally, you could justify a lot of things. Violence doesn't seem that far-fetched now.
Especially as it's entirely conditional, as I think Caleb pointed out. That there are many people who would have cheered any assassination of Donald Trump.
Sure, yep.
And yet they would clutch their pearls and cluck at the thought of someone in a Comanche hat breaking a window at the Senate. Sure. It's highly conditional. Yeah. They favor some political violence, but not others.
Definitely.
I think it's pessimistic, if I can say, in summing up the show, because none of us can be confident that the next presidential election will not be between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And insofar as that is true, then the absolute division, more or less 50-50 in the country, with stakes as high as they have ever been, perhaps higher than they have ever been. And add in the 400 million guns, add in the normalization of violence in American life, not just inside its own country, but perhaps more particularly outside its own country. For example, if it's entirely justified to assassinate an Iranian general who's actually on a peace mission and who's previously defeated ISIS and Al-Qaeda, General Soleimani, if that is legitimate at the airport in Baghdad, why would it not be legitimate to assassinate someone in the airport in Miami, Florida? These are the big questions. We'll continue to cover them here at Almayadeen. You've been a wonderful audience, and I thank you for watching.